Millionaire woman buys a homeless man a meal years later. He saves her company. Snow fell heavily on the streets of Manhattan that December evening in 2018, transforming the bustling city into a winter wonderland that most New Yorkers barely noticed as they hurried past, wrapped in expensive coats and focused on their destinations. The temperature had dropped to 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind whipped through the concrete canyons with a ferocity that made even the most hardened city dwellers seek shelter. Victoria Sterling stepped out of her sleek black Tesla onto the sidewalk outside Maria, one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants. At 42, she was the epitome of success, CEO and founder of Sterling Innovations, a tech company that had revolutionized supply chain management for Fortune 500 companies. Her tailored Armani coat, worth more than most people's monthly salary, provided perfect protection against the bitter cold. Diamond earrings caught the light from the restaurant's windows as she checked her Patek Philippe watch, a gift she had bought herself to celebrate her company's latest multi-million-dollar contract. Victoria had built her empire from nothing. Raised in a working-class family in Detroit, she had watched her father struggle to keep his small auto repair shop afloat during the city's economic collapse. She had sworn then that she would never know financial insecurity, and she had kept that promise. Sterling Innovations now employed over 800 people across 3 continents, and Victoria's personal net worth exceeded $200 million. As she walked toward the restaurant's entrance, something made her pause. Huddled against the building's facade, barely visible in the shadows between the warm glow of the restaurant's windows, sat a man who looked to be in his 30s. His clothes were layers of worn jackets and torn jeans, and he clutched a cardboard sign that read, "Homeless Veteran, please help, God bless." His hands, visible despite threadbare gloves, were red and chapped from the cold, and his breath created small clouds in the frigid air. Most pedestrians walked past without a glance, some stepping slightly wider to avoid any potential interaction. Victoria had done the same countless times before, not out of cruelty, but out of the protective numbness that city life often requires. Tonight, however, something was different. Perhaps it was the way the man sat with quiet dignity, not calling out or making a spectacle of the situation. Perhaps it was the military surplus jacket she could see beneath his outer layers, a reminder of service to his country. Or perhaps it was simply that this was the first time in months she had slowed down enough to truly see another human being in need. She stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of her Louis Vuitton purse on her shoulder, acutely aware of the stark contrast between her world and his. Inside that purse was more cash than this man might see in months, carried casually for incidental expenses. Her dinner tonight would cost more than many families spent on groceries in a week. Without allowing herself to overthink the decision, Victoria approached the man. Up close, she could see that despite his circumstances, he maintained a certain cleanliness and order. His hair, though long, was relatively clean, and his belongings were neatly arranged beside him. There was something in his eyes, not the vacant stare she might have expected, but an intelligence and awareness that spoke of someone who had once lived a very different life. "Excuse me," she said softly, her voice barely audible above the wind. The man looked up, surprise flickering across his weathered face. People rarely addressed him directly, and when they did, it was usually to ask him to move along. "I'm about to have dinner," Victoria continued, gesturing toward Maria. "Would you like me to get you something to eat?" The man's eyes widened slightly. In the years since he had found himself on the streets, he had received spare change, the occasional dollar bill, even a sandwich from time to time. But no one had ever offered to buy him a meal from a restaurant like this, a place where the homeless were typically discouraged from lingering nearby. That's very kind of you, ma'am," he replied, his voice hoarse from the cold but carrying the remnants of education and articulation. "But I don't want to cause any trouble for you or the restaurant." Victoria found herself studying his face more closely. There was a story there. She realized layers of experience and hardship, but also resilience. This wasn't someone who had given up on life, despite his circumstances. "What's your name?" she asked, surprising herself with the question. "Marcus," he replied. "Marcus Johnson." "Well, Marcus, I don't think it would be any trouble at all. What would you like to eat?" Marcus was quiet for a moment, as if trying to remember what it felt like to have a choice in what he ate. "Anything warm would be wonderful," he finally said. "I haven't had a hot meal in quite a while." Victoria nodded and disappeared into the restaurant. The Mater D recognized her immediately. She had been a regular customer for years, often dining alone while reviewing business documents or taking calls with international partners. She explained what she wanted, and though she caught a slight hesitation in his expression, her status as a valued customer ensured there would be no questions asked. 20 minutes later, she emerged with a large bag containing items she had carefully selected. A hearty portion of braised short ribs with polenta, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, and a thermos of hot soup. She had also included a piece of tiramisu, thinking that everyone deserved something sweet, especially during the holidays. Marcus was still there, though she noticed he had been watching the restaurant's entrance with obvious concern that she might not return. When he saw her approaching with the bag, his eyes filled with an emotion that Victoria couldn't quite identify: gratitude, certainly, but something deeper, as if this simple act had restored something he thought he had lost. "Forever. This is incredibly generous," he said as she handed him the bag. The warmth radiating from the containers was immediate, and she saw him close his eyes briefly, savoring the sensation. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Victoria replied, though she found herself genuinely moved by his reaction. Everyone deserves a good meal. As Marcus opened the containers, the rich aromas of the carefully prepared food wafted into the cold night air. Victoria watched as he took his first bite, and she saw something she hadn't expected: tears beginning to form in his eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, quickly wiping his face with the back of his hand. "It's just ... It's been so long since someone showed me this kind of kindness. Since someone treated me like I was still a person worth caring about." Victoria felt something shift inside her chest, an unfamiliar tightness that had nothing to do with the cold. "What happened, Marcus? How did you end up here?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, chewing thoughtfully. "I served 3 tours in Afghanistan," he finally said. "Combat engineer. When I came back, I thought I'd be fine. I had skills, experience, discipline. But the transition was harder than I expected. I couldn't sleep, couldn't concentrate. The nightmares were constant. I started drinking to quiet my mind, and when that stopped working, I found other ways to escape." He paused, taking another bite of food as if gathering strength from it. "Lost my job first, then my apartment. My family tried to help, but I was too proud to accept it and too broken to get better. By the time I was ready to accept help, I had burned too many bridges. The VA has programs, but the waiting lists are long, and when you're living day to day, it's hard to navigate the system." Victoria listened without interrupting, recognizing that this might be the first time in a long while that someone had simply listened to Marcus's story without judgment or impatience. "I'm not telling you this for pity," Marcus continued. "I made choices that led me here, and I take responsibility for that. But sometimes, when you've been invisible for so long, when people look through you like you don't exist, you start to wonder if maybe you really don't matter anymore." "You matter," Victoria said quietly, and she was surprised by how much she meant it. "Your service mattered. Your life matters." Marcus looked at her with an expression of such genuine gratitude that Victoria felt almost uncomfortable with the intensity of it. "Thank you for saying that. And thank you for this," he gestured to the food. "Not just the meal, but for seeing me. For treating me like a human being." Victoria reached into her purse and pulled out her business card, along with several $100 in cash. "I want you to have this," she said, offering both to Marcus. "And if you ever need help, real help, not just money, you can call me." Marcus stared at the business card, reading her name and title. "Sterling Innovations," he said softly. "I've heard of your company. You've built something impressive. How do you know about my company?" Victoria asked, surprised. "I may be homeless, but I still try to stay informed," Marcus replied with a small smile. "Libraries have computers and newspapers. I read about your latest contract with Walmart in the Wall Street Journal last week. Supply chain optimization is fascinating work." Victoria was taken aback. She realized she had made assumptions about Marcus's education and awareness, assumptions that were clearly wrong. There was more to his story than she had understood. "Keep the card," she said firmly. "I mean what I said about calling if you need help." As Victoria prepared to leave for her dinner, now running nearly 30 minutes late, Marcus called out to her. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, and she turned back. "I want you to know that this kindness you've shown me tonight, it's not just about the food or the money. You've reminded me that I'm still human, that I still have value. That's worth more than you could possibly know. Someday, if I'm ever in a position to return this kindness, I will. That's a promise." Victoria nodded, moved by the sincerity in his voice, though she couldn't imagine circumstances under which a homeless veteran would be able to help a millionaire CEO. "Take care of yourself, Marcus, and stay warm." As she entered the restaurant, Victoria found herself distracted throughout her dinner meeting. She kept thinking about Marcus's story, his dignity, and the intelligence that shone through despite his circumstances. She realized that in her relentless pursuit of success, she had insulated herself from the reality of people like Marcus, people for whom the American dream had become a nightmare. That night, lying in her penthouse apartment overlooking Central Park, Victoria couldn't stop thinking about their conversation. She had built her company on the principle of optimizing systems and processes, but she began to wonder what kind of system allowed someone with Marcus's background and intelligence to fall through the cracks so completely. Over the following weeks, Victoria found herself thinking about Marcus regularly. She drove by the spot where she had met him several times, but he was never there. She wondered if he had found shelter, if he had used her card to seek help, or if he had simply moved to another part of the city. She considered reaching out to local homeless services to try to locate him, but realized she didn't know his last name beyond Johnson, which would make finding him nearly impossible. The encounter had changed something in Victoria. She began noticing the homeless population in New York City in a way she never had before. She started carrying cash specifically to give to people she encountered, and she began researching organizations that serve veterans experiencing homelessness. The Victoria Sterling Foundation, which she established the following year, would eventually become one of the largest private funders of veteran services in New York State. But Marcus Johnson seemed to have vanished into the vast anonymity of the city, leaving behind only the memory of a profound human connection that had lasted less than an hour, but had changed the perspective of one of New York's most successful entrepreneurs. What Victoria didn't know was that Marcus had taken her words to heart in ways she couldn't have imagined. The kindness she had shown him that night had indeed reminded him of his own worth, and it had planted a seed of hope that would eventually grow into something extraordinary. But that part of the story was still years away from unfolding. 4 years passed with the relentless speed that characterizes life in the modern business world. Sterling Innovations had continued to grow, expanding into artificial intelligence and machine learning applications for supply chain management. Victoria's company now employed over 1,500 people and had offices in 12 countries. Her personal wealth had grown to nearly $500 million, and she had been featured on the covers of Forbes and Fortune magazines. But success in the tech industry is often fragile, built on innovation that can become obsolete overnight, and dependent on relationships that can shift with market forces and corporate politics. In the spring of 2022, Victoria found herself facing the greatest crisis of her professional life. It began with a phone call on a Tuesday morning in March. Victoria was in her corner office on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, reviewing quarterly reports, when her assistant buzzed in with obvious concern in her voice. "Mrs. Sterling, I have James Morrison from Apex Industries on line 1. He says it's urgent." Apex Industries was Sterling Innovation's largest client, accounting for nearly 30% of their annual revenue. James Morrison was their CEO, and their contract was worth over $200 million annually. Victoria picked up the phone immediately. "James, good morning. What can I do for you?" "Victoria, I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Morrison's voice was strained, lacking its usual warmth. "We've discovered some irregularities in the supply chain data your systems have been providing us. Our internal audit suggests there may have been manipulation of delivery timelines and cost calculations that have cost us millions of dollars." Victoria felt her stomach drop. "James, that's impossible. Our systems have multiple verification protocols, and I'm sorry, Victoria, but we've already brought in external auditors. The evidence is pretty damning. We're going to have to terminate our contract immediately and pursue legal action for damages." The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, but Victoria barely processed the details. By the time she hung up, she understood that Sterling Innovations was facing not just the loss of their biggest client, but potential lawsuits that could destroy the company entirely. Over the next several hours, the situation deteriorated rapidly. News of the Apex Industries contract termination leaked to the business press, causing Sterling Innovations' stock price to plummet by 40% in a single day. 2 other major clients called emergency meetings to review their contracts. Clearly spooked by the allegations against Victoria's company, Victoria assembled her top executives and legal team for an emergency meeting. Her head of technology, David Chen, looked pale as he presented his preliminary findings. "The manipulation appears to have been done at the system level," he explained, his voice tight with stress. "Someone with high-level access altered the algorithms that calculate delivery predictions and cost optimizations. The changes were subtle but systematic, designed to make our projections appear more favorable than they actually were." "Who had that level of access?" Victoria asked, though she dreaded the answer. "Only 5 people in the company, including you and me. The other 3 are Sarah Martinez in development, Tom Williams in operations, and Michael Zhang in analytics." Victoria felt sick. Someone she trusted implicitly had sabotaged her company, and she had no idea who or why. The next few days were a blur of emergency meetings, legal consultations, and damage control efforts. The FBI launched an investigation into potential securities fraud, and Victoria found herself facing the very real possibility that the company she had spent 15 years building might not survive the month dot by Friday of that week. Victoria was sitting alone in her office at nearly midnight, surrounded by legal documents and financial projections that all painted the same grim picture. Sterling Innovations was hemorrhaging money and clients, and unless she could find a way to prove the sabotage and restore confidence in her company's systems, she would be forced to declare bankruptcy within weeks. Her assistant had left hours ago, and the building was nearly empty. Victoria was so absorbed in the documents spread across her desk that she almost didn't notice the soft knock on her office door. "Come in," she called, assuming it was the night security guard making his rounds. Instead, a man in an expensive suit stepped into her office. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and intelligent eyes behind designer glasses. There was something familiar about him, but Victoria couldn't place where she might have seen him before. "Mrs. Sterling," he said, his voice carrying a slight gravelly quality that suggested a difficult past. "I apologize for the late hour, but I understand you're facing some challenges with your company." Victoria's first instinct was to call security. No one should have been able to access her floor without authorization, especially at this hour. But something about the man's demeanor, respectful, calm, and strangely comforting, made her hesitate. "I'm sorry, but who are you, and how did you get up here?" she asked. The man smiled slightly, an expression that carried both warmth and sadness. "My name is Marcus Johnson. We met once before, about 4 years ago, on a very cold night outside Maria Restaurant." Victoria stared at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the homeless veteran she remembered with the obviously successful businessman standing before her. The Marcus she had met was weathered, worn down by circumstances and hardship. This man carried himself with quiet confidence and wore clothes that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries. "Marcus," she whispered, hardly believing it was possible. "Yes, ma'am. I told you that night that if I was ever in a position to return your kindness, I would. Well, it turns out that night has finally come." Victoria rose from her chair, still trying to process what she was seeing. I can't believe it's you. You look so different. What happened? How did you, how did I go from being homeless to being here?" Marcus finished her question with an understanding smile. "It's a long story, but the short version is that your kindness that night reminded me who I used to be and who I could be again. You gave me more than a meal, Mrs. Sterling. You gave me back my humanity." Marcus moved closer to her desk and Victoria could see now that despite his transformed appearance, his eyes held the same depth and intelligence she remembered from that winter night. "After we met, I spent weeks thinking about what you had said, that I mattered, that my life had value. I realized I had been using my circumstances as an excuse to stop fighting for myself, so I decided to fight again." Victoria gestured for him to sit down, her business crisis temporarily forgotten in the face of this extraordinary transformation. "I got into a VA program for homeless veterans," Marcus continued. "It took 6 months to get a bed, but I waited. I got clean, got treatment for my PTSD, and started rebuilding my life piece by piece. The process wasn't easy. There were setbacks and moments when I wanted to give up. But every time I felt like quitting, I remembered that night when you saw me as a human being worth helping." "But how did you go from there to this?" Victoria gestured at his obviously expensive suit and confident bearing. Marcus smiled more broadly now. "Remember I told you I was a combat engineer in Afghanistan? Well, it turns out those skills translate pretty well to civilian life when you're healthy enough to use them. I got a job with a construction company, then started taking night classes in civil engineering. Within 2 years, I had my degree and was working for a major infrastructure firm." He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. "But the real breakthrough came when I started developing software to optimize construction project management. I had seen firsthand how inefficient many systems were, and my military experience had taught me to think systematically about complex logistical challenges." Victoria leaned forward, intrigued despite everything else that was happening. "I developed an algorithm that could predict and prevent supply chain disruptions in large construction projects. The software was so effective that I was able to license it to several major companies. Eventually, I started my own firm, Johnson System Solutions. We specialize in crisis management and system optimization for companies facing supply chain emergencies." The implications of what Marcus was saying began to dawn on Victoria. "You mean you've built a company that helps businesses with exactly the kind of problem I'm facing right now?"
Thank you for watching this story unfold with us here on M&A The Story Unfolds. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new tale. We'd love to know where you're watching. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of the world you're joining us from. Your support means everything. See you in the next story.